It was a Tuesday morning when my world broke into 1,000 quiet, invisible pieces. The sky was overcast but calm, the kind of gray that didn't predict a storm, just dulled the edges of the day. I had woken up early, showered, dressed in a navy blouse and gray slacks, and made my usual French press coffee before heading out for work. The routine had become a silent comfort, especially lately, when things at home had started feeling like background noise I was always trying to ignore. As I merged onto the freeway, NPR murmured through the speakers of my SUV, some piece on market trends and interest rates I wasn't really listening to. My thoughts drifted to the numbers waiting for me at the office, to the quarterly report I needed to finish, and the meeting with a new client scheduled after lunch. It was a day like any other until my phone rang. His name flashed on the screen, Richard. My thumb hovered over the green icon. My stomach clenched the way it used to when I was a teenager being called into the principal's office, even though I had done nothing wrong. I took a breath and answered. The call was brief, mechanical, and surreal in its cruelty. He said he was divorcing me, that he had already sold the house. His voice was flat, almost amused, and then he laughed, not a nervous chuckle, not a laugh of disbelief, a laugh that was cold and final, like a door slamming shut and being locked behind me. I pulled over to the shoulder, my fingers trembling, the phone still against my ear long after the call had ended. The sound of tires rushing past me was drowned out by the pounding in my ears. It wasn't just the betrayal, it wasn't even the divorce, it was the way he said it, so casual, so calculated, as though he had rehearsed it, as though I was an obstacle he had finally cleared. For 10 minutes, I sat there staring at the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. I wasn't crying, not yet, my body hadn't caught up to the words, but my mind was racing. We'd been married for 12 years, we'd built a life together, or at least I thought we had. I had no idea he was even thinking of leaving, and now apparently I was homeless. I called him back straight to voicemail again and again, nothing. I texted, "What house? What are you talking about?" No response. I turned off the freeway and drove not to work but back to the neighborhood where our house stood, or used to, Chestnut Lane. A curved, tree-lined street in a quiet suburb where every house looked like it had been copied and pasted from a high-end real estate magazine. I pulled into our driveway. The house was still there. The lawn was mowed. The red maple tree I planted in our first year of marriage had just started turning. The windows were closed, no moving trucks, no for sale sign. I stepped inside with the spare key in my purse. His things were gone. The bedroom closet half empty. The drawer where he kept his watches empty. The garage, his golf clubs, the Ducati motorcycle, the toolbox I wasn't allowed to touch, all gone. I stood in the middle of our kitchen staring at the granite island where we used to eat takeout and argue over politics, and suddenly I was crying, not quietly, not delicately. It was ugly and raw, the kind of sob that starts deep in the chest and claws its way out like it's been trapped for years. He had planned this. Of course he had. You don't just sell a house overnight, you don't pack and leave without planning, and you don't laugh when you tell someone you're leaving unless you've been waiting for the moment, savoring it. I wandered through the house in a haze, touching things like they were already someone else's. The photos on the mantle were still there, our wedding in Maui, the trip to Banff, the Christmas party at my old firm, lies or maybe just half-truths that expired without notice. In the study I found an envelope on the desk, my name on it, inside the divorce papers. Signed, filed, he had paid for a courier, the date on the filing, 2 weeks ago, he had already decided. I sat at my desk, staring at the wall, unable to do anything but breathe. My mind replayed every conversation we'd had over the past 6 months, the dinners he skipped, the business trips that felt longer than they should have, the nights he went to bed before me, the ones when he never came home at all. I had chalked it up to stress, to work, to the long, slow drift that happens in marriage. I hadn't fought it because I thought it would pass. I thought we were in a season, but I was wrong. I opened my laptop and accessed our joint account. My stomach turned again. It had been emptied completely. I checked the statements. Large transfers, discreet but obvious to someone who knew what to look for. I followed the trail. Offshore transfers, a new name I didn't recognize, Vanessa H., with a boutique apartment rental in Miami listed in a memo line. I didn't need confirmation. I knew she was the reason or the excuse. I thought of calling my sister, my best friend, my boss, someone, but I didn't want pity. I didn't want to hear "I'm so sorry." I didn't want to be the story someone whispered about over coffee. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how someone could be so heartless, and I wanted my life back. Instead of breaking down, I did what I do best. I made a list. 1. Contact my lawyer. 2. Review the deed on the house. 3. Lock down my personal bank account. 4. Change the locks now. I went to the safe in the back of the closet, the one we barely used except for passports and the original deed to the house. It was there with my name on it, just mine. I had almost forgotten. The house had been a gift from my father before he passed away, a piece of him he wanted me to have no matter what happened. We had discussed putting Richard's name on the deed but never followed through. I had insisted we wait just in case. I had forgotten that I protected myself when I didn't even know I needed protection. It was the only comfort I had that day. Everything else felt like ashes. But that deed, that single sheet of paper with my name on it, was a seed, a beginning, a quiet whisper that I wasn't entirely powerless, that maybe, just maybe, he had made a mistake. I left the house and drove to the locksmith. It was time to take my home back. I still didn't know how he had planned to sell the house. I didn't know if he had forged my signature or lied to an agent or simply assumed I wouldn't fight back, but he was wrong. He had underestimated the woman he had spent 12 years trying to manipulate. He thought his exit would be clean, final, victorious, but what he didn't realize was that I had something far more dangerous than revenge. I had the truth. And now I had plans. The days that followed that cruel phone call were not a blur as many would expect, they were painfully vivid. I remember the sound of the coffee maker sputtering every morning as I stood in the kitchen, no longer making 2 cups. The silence in the house had a weight to it, like a presence lingering just beyond sight, reminding me that everything was different now. Richard was gone, not just physically, but he had severed himself completely, emotionally, financially, legally, or so he thought. I spent the first few days in a haze of logistics. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp woman named Dana Rourke, recommended by a colleague who had gone through her own divorce a few years back. Dana didn't offer sympathy, she offered strategy. Within 20 minutes of our initial meeting, she had a notepad full of bullet points and arrows detailing a plan of action. Her clarity gave me something to hold on to when everything else felt unstable. The first step was confirming the title of the house. As I had suspected, the deed had never been modified. My father's signature remained on the original document and mine alone followed his. Richard had no legal claim to the property. He might have told someone he sold the house, but in reality, he couldn't sell what he didn't own. That revelation gave me a sliver of power, but it was only the beginning. I knew Richard. I had known him for over a decade, long enough to predict his moves, long enough to know he would never do something like this without a financial cushion. He was too proud to start over from scratch, too calculating to walk away from our marriage without securing his future, which meant he had been planning this for a while, and that meant there were traces, paper trails, digital crumbs, financial shadows. All I had to do was find them. I started with the joint accounts. Dana had already helped me freeze what was left, but the damage had been done. Over the previous 4 months, Richard had been systematically draining them. Small transfers at first, spaced weeks apart, just enough to avoid raising red flags, then larger sums masked as business expenses or wire transfers to vendors. But the names on those transactions didn't match any company I recognized. I started digging. My job had always given me an edge when it came to financial patterns. I wasn't just trained to read spreadsheets, I could interpret them like a second language. I cross-referenced every recipient name, every routing number. One caught my eye, an account registered in Belize under the name V&H Enterprises. I nearly laughed at the subtlety. V&H, Vanessa and him, he didn't even try to hide it. I followed the rabbit hole deeper. V&H Enterprises had been formed 6 months ago. I pulled public business records, scraped offshore filings through third-party databases. The company had no physical address, only a P.O. box, and it listed a single beneficiary, Vanessa Holloway. The name didn't appear on our tax records or Richard's phone logs, at least not under her real name. I ran a reverse lookup, Vanessa. She was 27, blonde, a self-described luxury lifestyle strategist. Her Instagram was public and it was a highlight reel of designer handbags, rooftop cocktails, yacht selfies, and motivational captions about knowing your worth. In more than one photo, I recognized Richard's watch, the one I gave him on our 10th anniversary. Another photo showed her standing on the balcony of a beach condo in Miami. I called a realtor friend in Florida and pretended to be interested in renting a unit there. A little polite prying, a few fake details, and she gave me what I needed. The leaseholder of Unit 18B was V&H Enterprises, paid 6 months in advance, in cash. That was it. That was where he had been disappearing to. Business trips, my ass. While I was working long hours, trying to patch the growing cracks in our marriage with patience and hope, he was building a new life with a woman who captioned her photos with hashtags like manifesting millions. The betrayal burned deeper the more I uncovered. It wasn't just infidelity, it was theft. It was deception laced with arrogance. Richard had orchestrated an exit plan that hinged on me being too blind, too soft, too trusting to see it, but he had underestimated me. I wasn't going to cry in corners and let him steal my life. Dana advised patience. Let him think he's winning, she said. The more rope he has, the easier it is to hang him with it. So I waited, I documented everything. I compiled spreadsheets, screenshots, notarized records, certified bank statements. I even hired a forensic accountant, someone Dana had worked with before. Her name was Lynn, and she had the demeanor of a librarian and the mind of a bloodhound. Within a week, Lynn had found 3 more accounts under shell companies that traced back to Richard's private email server. And then came the bombshell. One of the wire transfers, $47,000, had been pulled from the retirement fund he claimed to never touch. It was protected under both our names, something we agreed to never raid, not even during emergencies. He had forged my digital signature using a scan of my driver's license from an old file on our shared cloud. That was not just deceit, that was federal fraud. I sat in my living room that night, lights dimmed, rain ticking against the windows, and let the weight of it settle. Richard had destroyed everything we had built. And for what? For some fantasy life with a woman half his age, built on lies and stolen money. A life he thought he could buy while tossing me aside like a used receipt. But what he didn't realize was that I was no longer trying to save a marriage. I was building a case. By the time the week ended, I had a digital dossier that could bring down a small corporation. Dana reviewed everything, nodding slowly as she scrolled through folder after folder. "He's cooked," she said with the kind of calm that made me believe it. And I believed her. Because this wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about justice. And I was ready to deliver it. In the weeks following the discovery of Richard's offshore accounts and financial betrayals, my sense of self began to shift. I no longer felt like a victim clinging to the remnants of a ruined marriage. I felt like a strategist, a tactician operating in a chess game my husband didn't even realize he was losing. What he took from me, my peace, my trust, my years, he thought would leave me broken, but what he didn't account for was what I still had and what I still controlled. Chief among those things was the house. On paper, in law, and in truth, the house had always been mine. My father had purchased it in my name the year before he passed, knowing his illness was terminal. It was a final act of love, a promise that no matter what life threw at me, I would always have a place to call home. Richard had pushed several times over the years to add his name to the deed. He spun it as a gesture of unity, of commitment, but something inside me had always resisted. Maybe it was intuition. I kept the deed in the safe, untouched for years, forgetting how much power it truly held. But now that piece of paper was the cornerstone of my leverage. Richard, in his arrogance, had approached a real estate agent and initiated the process of selling the house without telling me. He forged paperwork poorly. When the realtor's assistant reached out for my confirmation signature, they had mistakenly sent it to my personal email, likely pulled from an outdated mailing list. That oversight was the reason I found out. I responded immediately and scheduled a call. I explained in very clear legal terms that Richard had no ownership over the property and that if they moved forward with any transaction, I would sue for fraud and damages. The realtor, a poised woman in her 50s, sounded rattled on the call. "We were told the home was jointly owned," she said, clearly blindsided. "He said you were out of the country." Out of the country, that's what he told them. I stared at the phone in disbelief. This man was conducting a criminal masquerade with the confidence of someone who believed he could never be caught. The house deal collapsed, the buyers withdrew. Richard, I later found out, had even accepted a deposit. That money would now be a legal liability hanging over his head. When he learned that the sale fell through, he showed up at the house. It was the first time I had seen him in nearly 3 weeks. He didn't knock, he used the code he still remembered from before I changed the locks, forgetting that I had already reset everything. The look on his face when he realized the door wouldn't budge was one I'll never forget, confusion turning into anger, anger into disbelief. He banged on the door, yelling my name, demanding to speak to me. I watched from the upstairs window. I didn't go down. Instead, I called Dana. "He's here," I said, trying to break in. "Don't engage," she replied immediately. "Let the authorities handle it." The police came within 15 minutes. They didn't arrest him, but they issued a formal warning. He left, red-faced, humiliated, and still under the delusion that he could talk his way out of this. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about truth and consequences and the slow unraveling of every lie he had ever told. By the end of that week, I had filed a civil injunction preventing Richard from initiating any further legal or financial actions involving our shared history without my written consent. Dana called it a strategic lockdown. I called it peace of mind. He tried calling me, texting me, emailing me from burner accounts. He wrote a pitiful letter, 8 paragraphs of faux contrition and blame shifting, but nothing he said could undo what he had done. You don't get to shatter someone's world and then ask them to sweep up the pieces for you. What Richard forgot, what he underestimated, was that I was not the same woman he married. I was no longer living in the comfort of illusion. I was standing in the clarity of truth. And with every step I took, I was reclaiming what was mine. Not just the house, but myself. Revenge is never as satisfying as justice. That's something I had to learn, not overnight, but gradually with every legal document I signed, every email I drafted, every page of evidence I filed into the binder that now sat at the edge of my dining room table like a silent weapon. I didn't want to destroy Richard's life. I wanted to illuminate it. I wanted every mask he wore, every lie he built his image on, to be torn away under fluorescent courtroom lights. Dana said timing was everything. The courts don't care about betrayal, Emily. They care about documentation, fraud, paper trails, motive. So I gave them exactly that. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Lynn, our forensic accountant, to refine the timeline. We charted every financial transaction, every wire transfer, and even cross-checked Richard's GPS data from our old shared cloud account. We compiled hotel bookings, luxury purchases, and phone records, all tied to Vanessa. Every charge he had tried to hide, we unearthed. Lynn was brilliant in her quiet, relentless way. She didn't just find hidden accounts, she found patterns in Richard's spending that aligned with corporate embezzlement. There were payments to shell companies posing as consultants, invoices to fake vendors, all routed through his business and written off as expenses. It wasn't just a divorce case now, it was a financial crime. Dana prepared a civil lawsuit on top of our divorce filings, one for fraud, misuse of marital assets, and financial misconduct. But that was just the beginning. We also submitted a confidential tip to the IRS, another to the SEC. We weren't just building a case, we were building pressure. And while all this happened behind the scenes, I played my role publicly. I kept my job, kept my routine. I smiled in meetings, attended client calls, and posted neutral updates on social media. Let him think I was licking my wounds. Let him believe he was ahead. Richard, meanwhile, had begun to unravel. A colleague from his firm reached out discreetly one evening asking if I knew why Richard had suddenly been acting paranoid, canceling meetings, redirecting funds, firing his own assistant. Word was spreading that something wasn't right. I said nothing. I knew silence was my greatest ally now. Then came the subpoena, delivered to his office during a board meeting. The timing was no accident, Dana made sure of that. A courier walked into the glass-paneled conference room and handed it to him in front of his peers. I wasn't there, but I imagined his face, the pale shock spreading beneath his skin like spilled ink. The lawsuit hit hard. It detailed not only the divorce but a full audit of his company's finances. It included allegations of corporate fraud, marital theft, and identity forgery. It had teeth, and it bit. Within days, I received a panicked email from Richard himself. It was long-winded, defensive, and full of veiled threats dressed up as apologies. He begged to talk. He asked to make this go away. But we were past that. I let Dana respond with a single line: all communications must go through counsel. There was no room left for sentiment, no space for nostalgia. He had set this fire and now he was trying to blow out the flames with hollow words. But this wasn't a fire I had to escape from. This was a forge and I was coming out stronger. Weeks turned into months. The legal process dragged as it always does, but I stayed steady. I met every deadline, I answered every request for evidence. I attended every deposition with unwavering calm, and each time Richard showed up with new legal counsel because he cycled through 3, I reminded myself that people who are innocent don't keep switching defense strategies. In mediation, he tried to play the charm card, told the arbitrator that he had simply fallen out of love, that we had grown apart, that he was sorry if I felt abandoned. But the documentation we had spoke louder than any spin he could attempt. The bank statements, the fake companies, the forged signatures, the hidden cash purchases, the photographs, the Miami condo. His new life wasn't a fresh start, it was built on theft. And the arbitrator saw right through him. The court ordered a full forensic audit of his company. Meanwhile, Dana negotiated a freeze on his personal assets until the conclusion of the proceedings. Suddenly, Richard couldn't access half of what he thought he still controlled. Vanessa, as it turned out, wasn't too fond of men without liquidity. She left him quietly, deleted photos, changed bios, moved out. When I saw it, I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate, I just closed the app and went back to organizing the next round of documents. I wasn't doing this for revenge, I was doing it for restoration. It was during this phase that I rediscovered something I hadn't felt in years: agency. Not anger, not bitterness, just control over my own story. I had lived too long in the shadow of someone else's ego, trying to fix what wasn't mine to fix. But now, with every legal win, with every layer of truth peeled back and laid bare, I was rebuilding something, not just my life. My identity. And I was doing it one fact at a time. By the end of the 4th month, Richard's attorneys proposed a settlement. It was desperate and laughably insufficient. He offered a small portion of our remaining assets in exchange for dropping the fraud charges. Dana declined without blinking. He wants a lifeboat, she said. Let him learn how to swim. We weren't done. Not yet. The morning of the final hearing arrived with the kind of stillness that doesn't calm you, it makes you hold your breath. I had slept maybe 4 hours, not from anxiety, but from the sheer gravity of what was about to unfold. It had taken months of digging, documenting, and presenting every piece of Richard's betrayal. Today wasn't just about the divorce, it was about exposing everything beneath the polished facade he had curated for years. I dressed deliberately that morning. No gray, no soft colors. I wore navy blue, sharp and commanding, with a tailored blazer and my father's antique gold watch, the one he gave me after I bought the house. I stood in front of the mirror and looked at a woman I barely recognized. Not broken, not fearful, someone solid, someone ready. Dana met me on the courthouse steps. Her black binder was thicker than usual. Her calm was ice cold. You ready to make this official? She asked. I didn't answer, I just nodded. Because yes, I was. Richard arrived 15 minutes later. I saw him before he saw me. He looked thinner, older somehow, like a man who had been chewing on guilt but refused to swallow it. His suit didn't quite fit him anymore, too loose at the shoulders, a little wrinkled. He carried nothing but his phone and a folded paper I couldn't see. He didn't look at me when we passed each other in the hallway, he looked through me. The courtroom wasn't full, just a few curious observers, some junior attorneys, and one court reporter setting up her stenotype. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, called us to order, and then it began. The first part was procedural: statements from both sides, review of the petition, acknowledgement of our failed attempt at mediation. Richard's attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, tried to frame their case around emotional incompatibility. He used words like irreconcilable, disconnected, communication breakdown. It was theater and poorly staged at that. Then Dana stood and everything changed. She began by presenting the timeline: months of financial abuse masked as normal transactions. She showed how Richard rerouted funds, concealed assets, and misused joint accounts. Then came the forged signature, the smoking gun. The court clerk projected the two documents on the screen side by side: the genuine signature from my old license and the one Richard had used to withdraw from our retirement fund. The room went still. Dana didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every fact landed like a hammer. Every scanned receipt, every shell company invoice, every trip booked under an alias, they weren't just mistakes. They were decisions. Calculated, repeated decisions made by a man who thought he was untouchable. When she reached the part about V&H Enterprises, the judge raised an eyebrow. This was the company formed for what purpose, counsel? To facilitate offshore transfers to Mr. Thompson's mistress, Your Honor, Dana said without blinking. Richard flinched just slightly, enough that I saw it. Vanessa's photos were not entered into evidence. We didn't need them, but the financial connection was airtight. Even the condo lease in Miami, 6 months prepaid in cash. The judge said nothing, but her gaze lingered on Richard longer than it had before. And then Dana dropped the final card: a statement from the IRS confirming an open inquiry into Richard's 1099 filings and undeclared income. That document hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. When it was Richard's turn to speak, his attorney tried to pivot. My client admits to some poor judgment, but we must also consider his contributions to their shared life, his business, his name, the sacrifices he made for their marriage. Dana stood again. With all due respect, Your Honor, Mr. Thompson did not make sacrifices. He made withdrawals from her accounts, her credit, and her trust, and the receipts speak louder than any remorse offered at this hour. The judge excused herself to review the evidence. We sat in silence for what felt like an hour. Richard wouldn't look at me. At one point, he opened the folded paper in his lap, a letter, maybe, or notes for a defense he never got to deliver. I wondered if it was the same one he had sent me weeks ago, begging for another chance. If it was, he never read from it. When the judge returned, her verdict was short but searing. She granted the divorce, awarded me full rights to the house and 80% of the remaining liquid assets. She also authorized further investigation into Richard's corporate activities, citing clear patterns of unethical and potentially criminal conduct. I didn't smile, I didn't cry. I just sat there feeling the weight of a gavel that echoed deeper than I expected. Afterward, Richard walked past me in the corridor, his eyes bloodshot and damp. He opened his mouth to speak, but I shook my head once, just once. He looked down and kept walking. Dana squeezed my shoulder. That's what truth feels like, she said. And she was right. It didn't roar, it didn't crash, it just arrived, like a final note at the end of a long, discordant song. And I was finally ready to write a new one. In the weeks that followed the court's ruling, I discovered something unexpected: the absence of chaos. No more legal calls interrupting my evenings, no more emails laced with tension and subtle threats, no more pretending to hold together what had long been unraveling. Silence became my ally, and in that silence I began to rebuild, not the marriage, not the illusions, but myself. The house, now officially mine, no longer felt like a battlefield. I stripped the walls of the last photographs of us, cleared the closets of anything that bore his scent, and changed even the light fixtures he once insisted on installing. One by one, I dismantled the remains of Richard's presence, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. It wasn't erasure, it was reclamation. Every corner of the home began to breathe differently. The living room, once stiff and overly curated for guests, became warm and inviting with second-hand books and mismatched throws. The kitchen no longer felt like a showroom. It smelled of garlic, fresh herbs, and the spontaneity of recipes I never had time for when my life was built around his schedule. And I began to write again. It had been years since I opened my journal, let alone wrote a story or an essay. But now each morning with coffee in hand, I returned to the blank page like a sanctuary. I wrote about women who found freedom in unexpected places, about betrayal that led to clarity, about homes that weren't made of bricks but of boundaries, choices, and second chances. I wasn't trying to publish. I was trying to hear my own voice again. Richard's world, meanwhile, began to crumble, quietly as expected. His company underwent a full audit which revealed more than even Lynn had predicted. Misappropriation, tax evasion, internal manipulation of board votes. He wasn't just a bad husband, he was a reckless executive. Investors pulled out, the board voted to suspend him pending investigation, and soon headlines followed, not splashy ones, but enough to tarnish the polished brand he'd worked so hard to maintain. He sent one final email, no subject line, just a few short sentences. "I never thought it would end this way. I'm sorry, you didn't deserve any of it. I hope you find happiness." I didn't reply, there was nothing left to say. Closure didn't require a back and forth. It came when I realized that his apology, late and incomplete, was not mine to carry. Forgiveness, I learned, is a quiet thing. You don't perform it, you live it. I took a short trip in the early spring. Packed light, drove up the coast with no itinerary, just a few audiobooks and a playlist filled with music I hadn't let myself listen to in years. I stayed in small towns, walked barefoot along beaches, ate alone without shame, and watched sunsets without checking the time. It was the first time in over a decade that I traveled not to escape, but to arrive at myself. Upon returning, I launched a small side project, financial literacy workshops for women going through divorce. Free sessions at the local library at first, then online. Word spread quickly. The women who came weren't broken. They were angry, confused, hopeful, tired, but resilient. I shared my story not as a warning, but as proof that endings could be beginnings in disguise. The house appreciated in value over the months. I refinanced it in my name alone and used some of the equity to invest in a nonprofit startup supporting single women navigating legal transitions. It felt full circle. The same skills Richard once mocked me for, my precision with numbers, my obsession with planning, were now the very tools I used to build something meaningful. Friends began to invite me out again. I started to say yes, slowly, not to fill the space Richard left behind, but to remember the fullness of life before him. I laughed more, ate slower, danced at a friend's wedding without needing someone's hand in mine. One evening, sitting on the back patio with a glass of red wine and the soft hum of crickets around me, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, fully, authentically, on my terms. And that house, once the center of betrayal, now stood as a monument to my resilience. Its rooms bore witness to every tear and triumph. Its walls, once echoing with silence, now sang softly with the life I had chosen. This wasn't the life I planned. It was better. Because it was mine.